broken ADPs in the pre-draft best ball contests and how to exploit them. That's what we're going to talk about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. And he was just telling me before the show he's been writing a bunch in the last couple of days, several pieces that will be hitting the RotoViz pages in the coming days, week, depending on how long you want to toy with editing, as you were telling me you've been doing a little bit of. Shawn, we're going to talk today about a lot of the players in these early drafts. I just got back from a spring break vacation with my kids, and I was out of state, so I was able to jump into some of the Underdog big board contests, some slow drafts. So I'm getting a couple dozen drafts going under my belt and to have some early opinions that have been pretty exciting. It's always fun to get the draft on my own as opposed to just doing the co-drafts with you or with the ship chasing guys. And so lots of thoughts there. You have done some great content recently. You were a guest over at Ship Chasing while I was gone. You did a pod with our buddy Pat Corain over at Legendary Upside, talking about your guys' rankings over on Underdog. And so a lot of discussion about this stuff. We have a couple more weeks until the draft. Everyone's doing a lot of drafting right now before these contests that are pre-NFL draft contests are going to close. Drafting's a year-round thing now. So it's the early off-season deadline, almost like week one, that the NFL draft hits, and then we'll have, more contests later and things are going to shift and all those types of things. Certainly after the rookies have landing spots, it will change things to a certain degree, but a lot we want to talk about. Before we dive into all of that, we do have to address our new format. We got a lot of feedback. Last week, we did it as the way that we released the pods was a longer pod first, and then our shorter pods. We talked through it a little bit on the show, maybe didn't explain it particularly well. The idea is we like to have long conversations, you and me, Shawn, but we also want to have shorter content for the listeners that want more concise and shorter stuff. There are, just to be blunt, metrics that show that that's better. And so we've been jostling with this or grappling with this throughout the length of Stealing Bananas, trying to do shorter content at times. And sometimes it's kind of made, we feel, our content maybe not as great. And so we want to be able to just do it the way that we want to, but also release it in the ways that are better for consumption and those types of things. And so we will continue to be doing it this way going forward. Long conversations, maybe 2-hour recording sessions that we're going to do in the off season that allow us to just block off a lot of time and really get into our conversations with each other, but not have to, necessarily record multiple times per week and things like that. But then also release them as shorter, because we have lives, obviously. Not because we don't want to talk multiple times per week, but then also release shorter versions of that pod. We are not entirely sure how that's going to look on your guys' feed. I got a lot of requests for us to label that stuff better, and we will try to. But just to know for the listener, you will see long pods and you will see short pods, and most of the content from the short pods, or all of the content probably, will be contained in the longer pods. There will be additional stuff in the longer pods, but we're trying to isolate some of the subject matter and smaller topics into some smaller, more bite-sized, consumable pieces. Again, we don't know. Last week we did the longer one first and then some shorter ones, which caused a lot of confusion because the multiple shorter ones were duplicative. We might be doing the shorter ones first and then releasing the full long one after. We're not entirely sure how we're going to go about it. Appreciate your guys' understanding. This long-term is going to be the right move for Stealing Bananas. It's the best way for us to record. It's the best way, I think, for us to get content to you guys, and for the varying different types of people. A lot of you that we heard from are going to listen to the long ones anyway. That's kind of the people who we heard from. And then like, well, I'm listening to the whole long one. Should I also listen to the short one? Others are going to be people who want to just listen to some of the shorter ones. So that's, part of what we're trying to accomplish is not hindering ourselves from the long conversations, but also releasing shorter, more focused stuff. So anyway, that's a long explanation there. But Shawn, as we jump into this, the first thing that I brought to you that I noticed right away relates to the Stefon Diggs trade, which just happened last week. Stefon Diggs was going reasonably high in these drafts, and Nico Collins was as well. early in the offseason, Nico and Tank Dell were both going, I think, in like the second round. Tank has fallen some. But as I sit here and look at Underdog's ADP right now, Nico and Diggs are back-to-back at 22.3, 22.6, right in the back part of the second round still there. I've seen some of the receivers right behind them go ahead of them in some of my early slow drafts, and I'm often on the clock staring at those two as the top ADPs because they're sliding a little bit. Their ADPs are a little higher than where they're probably going in just like the last day or two. But they're both still sitting there in the second round, despite now being teammates. They were previously locked into those ranges. And there's that dynamic in these early drafts where drafters there's a lot of repeat drafters. They're aware of what the ADPs were, and there's the anchoring effect and how much do they slide. And so getting a good value on a player that was never previously going that late means they end up getting scooped. And so they don't necessarily fall like a stone sometimes. And I think we're seeing that effect here a little bit where these two guys are both lingering in the late second. And at the same time, Tank Dell is still at 39 in ADP, basically the 403, right after the end of the third round. You have three receivers for this Houston offense, very, very high now. Probably not the way I would suggest that it's going to look in August, but I think part of it is they're all interesting guys, and nobody wants to be out on. I think there's some confusion about who the market wants to actually drop down and who they actually like. And we're getting this dynamic a couple different places. I see it in Chicago as well. Personally, I think it's interesting to see after the Keenan Allen trade that DJ Moore hasn't fallen that much. And there's a pretty big gap still between Moore and Allen where, I mean, regardless of where you put them, I think they should be pretty close together objectively. Whether they're both second rounders or fourth rounders is a different conversation. I would probably lean more towards fourth, but we'll talk about the Bears maybe in a minute. But as far as the Texans are concerned, this is a big cluster. It's an offense we want to be excited about. CJ Stroud's going into year two. There's some stuff about year one where, as amazing as he was still probably limited in volume a little bit. He's a rookie, probably not given the full reins, where you're saying everything he did was right and was amazing and was good. But also year two is when then he probably gets unchained a little bit and gets to really go out there and throw high pass rate over expected, all of those things. They're playing in a great stadium for passing environment, late season, all of that. Their whole division is in the South. You're not dealing with, we don't know the schedule yet, but likely not dealing with late season issues in terms of outdoor, weather games. It's not like they're playing in the AFC North or anything. And so you have this Houston team that looks really exciting and we should be really excited about. And when I was talking to you about this and saying these three receivers, they need to come down somehow, you also were telling me you're looking at it maybe the opposite way.
Well, this is so much fun because it's not straightforward at all, right? The backgrounds of these three receivers are complicated enough or unclear enough, each in their own ways, that I don't think that we can look at it and be like, well, this guy's the star. This guy is the person who is good, but is going to lose volume. And then this guy is the odd man out. Not that we would necessarily even have that balance anyway, right? I mean, these three guys could all do well, but all be limited a little bit by each other. I guess that's how I think it will probably work out. But it is interesting because we think back to our conversations last offseason. And one of the things we noted was that it's difficult for the rookie QBs to get out there, to have the high pass volume, to carry their offenses. It might be especially difficult in Carolina and Houston because these quarterbacks were not surrounded by elite weapons. And then obviously the Indianapolis situation is so different, with Richardson being a different type of prospect. It turned out that arguably the situation in Carolina caused problems for Bryce Young. The situation obviously in Houston did not cause problems for CJ Stroud. A lot of that is probably on the quarterbacks. And then a lot of it obviously has to be on the receivers as well, because we saw the Houston guys perform at a level that even if your quarterback is awesome, you simply can't do if you're not also bringing something to the table yourself. Whereas, Bryce Young was almost certainly limiting his guys, even though they didn't bring much to the table. But that's one of the things that's just so fun about this quarterback wide receiver relationship in football, is that you don't always know. Now, I want to go back to last offseason where Dave Caban did some fantastic research looking at how difficult it is to project quarterbacks and yet saying, look, based on what we do know, I mean, CJ Stroud is an extraordinary prospect, and he should be the guy by, a wide margin. Unfortunately, I didn't stick to that. And there was enough support for Bryce Young that it got mixed for me. One of the things I would say is that Dave has got some great research out on this year's class. If you're interested in that, jump on over and check out his article there. But, whether his research specifically was able to uncover like the keys to why CJ Stroud was going to be good, or separate from that, CJ Stroud was just amazing. I mean, it's very clear cut that CJ Stroud was amazing, right? And so I don't think that we have any questions about that. And I love this offense for 2024 because they have the three guys. Now, one of the things that, I told you over and over that I thought was going to happen is that they would add a receiver, because for me, Collins and Dell were sort of your prototypical number 2 and number 3. And then if you add a guy who is really the true difference maker, then Houston's going to be one of the best offenses in the NFL, potentially one of the best teams in the NFL. So then they add Stefon Diggs, which is very interesting because Diggs is coming off of this season where in the first half, he looks like himself. And then in the second half, he looks like a guy who is completely and totally done. And that brings back up these issues that he has when he's not a star, the issues that he had at times in Minnesota that got him out of there. Now he's no longer with the Bills. But how much of this do you think is on Diggs? How much of it potentially is on Allen? And then how much of it is on this coordinator change? Because, you can break this season into two halves, and it's absolutely extraordinary, right? I have our game splits app pulled up. You look from week 1 to 9, and then week 10 to 17. In this first half, in the full PPR, Diggs is at almost 22 points per game. In the second half, he's below 10, right? Not even in double figures. And you go down through receptions, touchdowns, targets, yards. The pace on all of those is more or less double, except for touchdowns, where it's like 13 to 2, right? Now, we know that some of this stuff, especially with touchdowns, is going to be fluky or, especially the result of variance. But, he's a completely different player. And he obviously wanted to get out of there in part because he doesn't want to participate in the style of offense that the Bills ran in the second half of the year. But you're also talking about a guy who's now in his 30s, where anytime you have this drop-off, it's going to be concerning. At the same time, this wasn't a drop-off between seasons. This was something where you can pretty directly, trace the breadcrumbs to a decision that the Bills made with how good he was in the first half. I guess I'm not convinced that he's done. And when you look at the numbers for the full year on especially these top two guys, you're talking about in the SIS numbers, you have targets per route identical. You have ADOTs identical. So obviously there you're going to have the weighted targets per route identical. The one guy is a young ascending player. And one of the things that I did feel like really changed for me as the season progressed is like, I might be wrong on Nico Collins here, because he is utterly dominant, which you see in his stats. Obviously, the big thing then is that you have a huge gulf between the yards per target for Diggs and the yards per target for these other guys. And I think that you can trace that in many ways to just how well CJ Stroud played. You can trace it to really a season that wasn't great as a passer in many ways for Josh Allen. But, beyond that, you could certainly still prefer these young guys, these young ascending players in the Texans offense who have already demonstrated it with CJ Stroud. I've got some other thoughts on Collins and Dell as well, but I wanted to get, where you are with Diggs versus Collins and how we should be looking at that.
Yeah, I think you set that all up really well, especially talking about how they're really interesting profiles. One of the things that I love about this trade is when I wrote up my targets per out run posts, which are really just, and I've talked about this before, but targets per out run is sort of my foundational piece, but they're really like the whole wide receiver profile. These were three players that I needed to add a lot of context to. It wasn't just like what their targets per out run say or what their stats say. Like there's context around what they are, where they are in their career. I'm often looking multiple years back at the longer view for these guys. You just mentioned a lot of really interesting context for Diggs as it relates to the first half of the season and the second half of the season. But when you look at his full numbers, and you talked about how his full numbers are very similar to Nico, but I would also say when you look at his full numbers relative to his first 3 years in Buffalo, the targets per out run are very similar. The ADOT a little bit lower in the end because you mentioned the second half it comes down a little bit, but the weighted targets per out run, which is that metric that takes some air yards element into the targets per out run, very, very close all 4 years for Diggs. In fact, 0.67 his first year in 2020, 0.65 his second year, 0.69 and 0.69. 4 years in a row in this really thin, narrow range of 0.65 to 0.69, where his volume earning, that's all very, very good, obviously. I mean, he had a couple great seasons in Buffalo at that volume. In 2020, his yards per target was very good. He had a great 2020. In 2021, the yards per target fell way down. A big part of that was his catch rate fell way down. And so it was, like his yards per reception wasn't horrible, but his catch rate was horrible. That really impacted his yards per target. 2022, we talked about, well, if that catch rate comes back up, it can bounce back. He still earned volume in 2021. That all happened. His 2022 looks almost identical to his 2020, where it all bounced back exactly the way that you would hope. Volume stayed strong, yards per target, catch rate, all of those elements came back. And then 2023, the end of season numbers, volume stays strong again, yards per target falls. A little bit different. It wasn't all catch rate in this. His yards per reception fell as well. Catch rate was still kind of solid. It was down, but still kind of solid. It wasn't so clearly an outlier as 2021 was. And when you talk about the yards per reception side of it falling, you start talking about age. You start talking about maybe he's a little less explosive, but you talked about the usage in the second half and how maybe that was more about the team level. The point I would drive home is he didn't stop earning alpha volume as a number one for the Bills. He didn't get worse last year in that regard. The efficiency side of it scares me a little. And we have a few different older receivers where the volume continued to be fine and it was mostly efficiency last year that are an intriguing group this year. Devontae Adams still earned a ton of volume last year, but his yards per target fell way down. DeAndre Hopkins still earned a bunch of volume last year, but his efficiency was down a little bit. There's a couple guys like that I'm looking at that type of targets per run profile and saying, well, this guy still earned big volume. If they can be efficient on that, they can actually have a rebound year a little bit. Kind of in the way that we've seen rebound years for like the Keenan Allens and Mike Evans, some of these older, good long view receivers that had down seasons in recent years and then rebounded to even to more like prime seasons for them in 2023. I think that's possible for some of those names I just mentioned in 2024, including Diggs. The other thing about Diggs that I can't shake is this dude is insane. Stefon Diggs is a crazy person. And I say that in a good way in terms of whether you want to draft him as a fantasy receiver. They restructured his whole contract, so it's a 1-year deal and he can hit free agency. I think part of that on Houston's end is as long as he doesn't blow up our whole team and things go well, I think they could probably just franchise tag him unless there was a stipulation that they can't. But I think they're thinking in terms of 1 year or 2 year, like CJ Stroud's rookie window. Because also they're probably thinking the guy that we want to extend is Nico Collins. The guy that we want to have long-term is Tank Dell. That's the once we have to pay CJ Stroud an extension in a couple of years, we got to have these young receivers with him. So Diggs is somebody we're going to drop in here to really go for it while we're in the CJ Stroud rookie contract window. And I love this on Houston's team building side. But at the same time, then you think about Stefon Diggs and all the reports around it are this guy, he has ex-teammates tweeting, this guy's going to work harder than anybody in the league. He's going to have the biggest chip on his shoulder, blah, blah, blah. Cole Beasley tweeted it. A couple other guys, this is my guy. He's going to work his butt off. I mean, is Cole Beasley's opinion something that we should really be valuing on the show? Probably not. But I do think all the evidence that we have on Stefon Diggs is he's going to not only work incredibly hard in Houston, he's going to be a thorn in the side of the offensive coordinator and CJ Stroud and all of those things to make sure that he gets his targets. Now, that could end up blowing up, right? There are ways that could be bad. He is only on a 1-year deal, and if he's a huge cancer, maybe mid-season, they're we don't want you around the team anymore. It could be a late career Antonio Brown situation, which, not trying to make that direct comparison because we know Antonio Brown's had some troubles in his personal life, but more so saying where some of the risk that we need to consider might lie. There could be some concerns like that with Diggs. I tend to believe that he's going to be like a model citizen. He seems to be that way when his back's against his wall throughout his career. If you kind of look at it, he had some issues in Minnesota, and then they went away when they needed to. When he went to Buffalo, there weren't issues right away. It was all happy. And I think it's going to be pretty happy in Houston in the short term. And I mean, again, like a dude like that, though, that also is the kind of personality that's like in the huddle going to be like, I'm open. I beat this guy. I can win on this route, whatever it is. I think there's little bits of that kind of stuff that plays into why these guys get such dominant target shares over the years. I think that's going to matter for Diggs. And so you talk about his long-term profile. He's earned the volume every year in Buffalo. And then you compare it to Nico's. Very similar for Nico last year in Houston. The difference is Nico's prior 2 years weren't like that. They were good. His rookie year, not very good, actually. But his second year, good. Took a step forward, earned some more volume at a higher ADOT, more volume per route. Efficiency wasn't really there. And then he took another step forward. The targets per out run went up in year 3, and the efficiency exploded, like 4 yards per target higher. And suddenly he's a 3+ yards per route run guy, which is elite. It's better than any year of Stefon Diggs' career. And so from that regard, you're like, okay, well, Nico Collins just had a season last year in this offense with this quarterback that's better than anything Diggs has ever done in terms of, the overall profile of yards per route run, the targets, and the yardage per route. And so you have to feel really good about Nico. You just said that about how dominant he was, how good he looked throughout the year. At the same time, there's an element of it that's like, where was this the first 2 seasons when he was below 2 yards per route run and well below 2? Good, but not showing this type of elite upside. And also the context of this happened in an offense that had Tank Dell doing well as well, but Dell then misses a lot of time after his injury, and then basically had nothing else. It had Robert Woods running 400 routes close to the team high, and they were 400 completely empty routes. And sometimes when we talk about the targets per out run stuff, I talk about these players that are so bad at earning volume that they're good for the numbers of the other players. And this is something I've talked about with Woods' impact on what Nico and Tank Dell were able to do earlier in the offseason. I don't know if we were recording Stealing Bananas yet. I think it was more on ship chasing. But I was talking a little bit about, look, Noah Brown had career high targets per out run. He had volume per route that looked incredible based on his career in a bit role, in part because he was also in this environment where he was running routes against Robert Woods, and Dalton Schultz is there. But Dalton Schultz is like your average. He'll get the targets that come to him. Not a big target earner. Never was in Dallas either. He was a big routes runner in Dallas, which is why he's been fantasy relevant in the past. Not a volume earner, more like he'll be open when he's the second or third read in the progression, and so he'll get some volume. He'll get targets. I'm into him a little bit as a tight end actually this year going forward, but he's not somebody that's going to steal volume. And again, Robert Woods was not somebody who's going to steal volume. So it was an environment along with an elite rookie quarterback where Nico could thrive, and he thrived in a way that he hadn't in his first 2 years. Now, I think he took a step forward, and I think that's clear, and I don't expect him to go back to what he was in those first 2 years. But I also think you have to acknowledge that there wasn't much competition there. And the fact, like those 400 Robert Woods routes, the point I have made on ship chasing earlier in the offseason is they were going to go to somebody better. Like the Texans were going to add depth. The fact that they had to rely so much on Robert Woods, the fact that they had to rely on Noah Brown as much as they did, they want to go after this window. I didn't think they were going to go trade for Stefon Diggs. I thought they might draft a receiver, though, and add another interesting name to the mix. But now that they go draft or go trade for Stefon Diggs, it's really interesting because Diggs, I think, does have the potential to come in and be an alpha immediately and sort of make Nico into a secondary high-efficiency player, almost like the T. Higgins to a Jamar Chase, although I wouldn't say Diggs would be on Chase's level. But the sort of the clear number 2 in terms of volume is the point, and at a high ADOT and a contested catch and ball win or high TD rate like Higgins can be at his best. That could be Nico. Now, Nico could still be the alpha as well. And so I've had a hard time. That's you mentioned these are interesting profiles. That's the way I'm looking at it, is like Diggs's profile pre-2023, consistently earning volume at every single year of his career and keeping that up in 2023 is strong enough that I tend to lean his way a little bit more in terms of the volume. But Nico's success with CJ Stroud just last year, the 1 year, because he didn't have it the prior years with the other quarterbacks, and the volume bump that he had with Stroud and that rapport that's already built, I feel really strongly about him that he's going to be efficient and that he's going to be good. Maybe a little, like I give the 60-40 edge to Diggs on the actual target volume. So maybe I'm a little bit less comfortable with Nico as the clear number one in earning volume. But I don't think it's like, again, I think like 40% of the outcomes, Nico's the target leader in the offense. The third guy, again, is Tank Dell. And that's where I get a little more concerned, Sean. And you mentioned you had some notes on Nico and Tank. I'll just finish up my thoughts here by mentioning my thoughts on Tank. He was very good last year, very efficient like Nico. The targets per route were good, but not amazing necessarily. High ADOT, and for the ADOT, it was a strong weighted targets per route. But overall, his yards per route run almost a full yard lower than Nico. Good, very, very good. Great for a rookie. But in the context, again, of not having much target competition, getting out into routes where down the field where I think you can talk about the scheme and creating space. There's going to be a lot of debate about whether, CJ Stroud did this for the receivers or vice versa. I think in Tank Dell's case that a lot of it comes back onto Stroud. I think he can still be very successful, but I would have more concern. And I have more concern about him for a couple of reasons, including his size. Now, he didn't get hurt receiving. He got hurt run blocking in the red zone, and it's a big question about why he was even being tasked with that. But he was on the field run blocking in the red zone and got rolled up on. And that is, a concern. A smaller, anybody can get rolled up on, but a smaller player, smaller, muscles, ligaments. I don't know. You can think about that however you want to. My perspective on that is the concern is that they can hold up to the rigors of NFL games and the amount of brutality that is out there for 60 minutes for 17 weeks. And we did see some concern there in that regard in year one, where Dell loses the second half or the latter third or whatever it was of his rookie season to injury. He's probably going to be fine going into year two, and he very well might make it through the whole season in a healthy way. But that's a minor concern for me as well. In addition to just feeling like, I think ADP has it right, that the Diggs and Collins are the clear debate about who's the number one. But I think Dell is sort of a distant third. He's still going at 39 ADP. I mentioned I have not been taking him there in my early drafts. I need him to fall at least well into the 40s personally. And I have seen him slip there. And I think I did draft him at like 45 in one draft, but mostly just to get some exposure. I think he probably needs to be in the fifth round. But I don't know. I'm curious your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah. So one of the things that I really like to do is to try and make sure we're understanding the full trajectory of a player's career. Because if a guy is simply going out there and doing it every single season, then the risk that you have is a lot less. And that's something that I think, don't necessarily have for Nico Collins. And it's one of the reasons why you might be skeptical about him compared to the other two players. Now, the amount of skepticism you can have for a player who just posted the type of season that he did, is minimal, right? But when we're talking about the price here, you have to really pay up to get him, and now it's a complicated situation. So that's where I think that you've got to consider the context. You look at his career at Michigan, and it's one of those from a total volume perspective, and then from a per play perspective, doesn't really lead you to believe that he's going to be one of these guys who becomes an NFL star. And that's the reason, he goes 89th overall. You look at his athletic profile and you're thinking, that dude could be, exactly what he just was last season. Now, the thing about it is that mostly what we get from that athletic profile are guys who get overdrafted. The NFL is overly excited about them. It goes into all of these things where the players tend to bust, and you're like, just keep in mind that the athletic profile for these receivers is not necessarily the determining factor. And yet once you have a player who has done what he did, and then you go back and you're like, he's also one of the most athletic players in the NFL and has this great size, then you're saying, how are you going to stop him when he is matched up with this type of quarterback, right? The other thing that happened, and you mentioned this The first 2 seasons, not particularly good. The rookie season, again, when you're drafted 89th, it's going to be a little bit different in terms of the situations you're put in versus being drafted in the top 20 picks. And so having a very mediocre rookie season, not as big a deal. That second year, if he plays a full year, then I think you get a better sense of where he was going to be. I mean, this is a guy who didn't score touchdowns until you have CJ Stroud there, and now he looks, again, sort of unstoppable. You mentioned that Diggs has never had a season like the one he just put up. Another piece of context there that I actually do think is very relevant for how we're looking at the upside for these receivers, but also some of the risks that they bring. The first 2 years, Collins was at -14 and -11 in fantasy points over expectation. Last year, he's at 71.5. Right now, I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying you should take 70 points off of his score, but I mean, it's a lot, right? And so if you have a situation where the previous handful of seasons were not particularly strong, and then you have this massive blow-up season, you've got to at least consider that as some context for it. Now, Dell is interesting because he comes into the NFL off of a couple of massive seasons at Houston, but you're talking about a small school guy who did it when he was old. I mean, you come in there and you're a 24-year-old rookie. Right. So anybody, if you followed sort of the prospect research for the last decade, someone who comes in as a small school player and a 24-year-old rookie is, I mean, the odds of that working out again are not great. But once it does work out, then you can fade a lot of those concerns simply because, I mean, this is a guy who now 3 years in a row has put up like massive numbers. And so I think from that perspective for me, and the other thing obviously is he's tiny. And so that also is going to be a worry right up until he shows he can do it at the NFL level. And then you're like, okay, well, I mean, he's now one of this wave of small receivers who's going to be fine, if not electric. And so we put these 3 guys together. And for me now, I mean, I think that you're probably going to lose on one of these 3 players at least. And yet I could see drafters winning on 2 of them. It also, I think, is interesting because there are a lot of situations this season where I guess I'm not like that interested in the stacking. I'm not saying I'm going to shy away from the stacking or that that's not something that you need to do at times, but you're going to have teams and players where it feels like a very dynamic tournament winning type of move versus players where you're like, I think that in many cases, you're actually going to be just fine, if not better off, if you're putting that player onto a team where the stack is a different group of people. But when you look at these prices here, I mean, one of the things that jumps out is with these 3 receivers, CJ Stroud should not be QB4, and he should not be close to Patrick Mahomes, right? I think that he should be a lot closer to Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts even than he should be to Lamar Jackson. Now, we know that the issue here is that he's not going to have the rushing value of those guys, but you go back and look at like what is going to set up for a season where you could have 5,000 passing yards and 50 touchdowns, and It's this type of dynamic. And I mean, one of the things too with like Collins and Dell, all of those yards, Stroud was making these magical, almost impossible types of plays consistently, where he would get pressure, he would spin out of it, he would keep the play alive as opposed to throwing the ball away, he would keep the play alive as opposed to scrambling, and then he would hit a guy 30 yards down the field with a strike, with one of these passes that would come out of his hand, and you're like, you know, there are only 2 or 3 other quarterbacks in the world who can throw it like that and hit a guy, you know, in rhythm 30 yards down the field. So is that going to unlock Diggs down the field? I think in all likelihood, yes. Is there going to be an element where Diggs' ability to get open more quickly than, say, a Nico Collins, like cuts into Collins' volume a little bit? I would guess that that's also the case. But the main thing for me is I think all 3 of these guys can score. And certainly if Dell is going to be the cheapest player, I'm fine with going after him. And so I actually have him a little bit above ADP. I think the upside there for the spike games is pretty extreme. And just, I mean, you're minimizing your risk, even if it's just in a tiny way, by taking the guy who's at that 3-4 turn as opposed to these guys who are in the second round. I do think, though, that even if you want to go in some kind of path where you're reaching for the players and putting them together, this would be a situation where I'm fine to reach for them to get 2 of the 3 and then to get Stroud as well. You think about the value of the passing QB, you know, maybe it's not as much full season without the rushing, but if we're talking about in tournaments and having a massive, massive game in week 15 or 16 or 17 or wherever, and with it just being a winning formula for you all season long, I think that the main takeaway for me is I like all three receivers. I love this quarterback. I think that what they could do as a passing offense this season is maybe the most exciting and perhaps the most relevant story in all of fantasy football. And the Houston Texans should be that much fun.
I absolutely love that point. Man, there's so many good things you just said there that I want to like build off. But we toyed with doing this show sort of through like we sometimes have talked in the off season about futures odds and things like that, which has been fun. We did it more, I think, 2 years ago than we did last year. But the Texans, I had messaged you a little bit as we were talking through how to frame this week's show. The Texans are still behind like the Ravens and Bengals and Bills in odds to win the AFC. And I just think that's wrong. I think they might be the biggest threat to Kansas City. I think they might be the second best team, which I think takes people off guard. But we've talked about the rookie QB window for a long time, Sean. They went out and added Danielle Hunter from the Vikings, multiple other front seven guys. They had the defensive rookie of the year last year as well, because you have the salary cap space when you have a rookie quarterback. Then they go out and trade for Diggs. They didn't just make their offense better, they made their defense a lot better. I think they're going to be very, very good. But the other thing that we talked a little bit about last year, and I didn't know how to articulate this, but I remember talking about Mahomes and the Chiefs and where they're at in their like life cycle as a team. We talked in the offseason about like maybe they won't really push it in the regular season as much because they're not. Mahomes had his 5,050 season. They're not really out there trying to do that in 2023 and now again in 2024. And it was really interesting after they won the Super Bowl again this year that they talked about, or Andy Reid directly said in a press conference question, I believe, that they intentionally limited Travis Kelce's routes. He had much fewer routes during the regular season. I remember writing about this earlier in the offseason, so I'm pretty confident this is a real fact, and I'm not just dreaming it, but you never really know in April. Sometimes you're just making things up. But the Andy Reid note was relevant to me in the sense that it was confirmation that, yeah, this team isn't thinking about regular season records. They're thinking about, we got to play 4 games in the postseason, maybe, or 3. I mean, this year they had to play 4. When you're the Texans and you're going into year 2, you're still testing the limits of what you are, and so it's different. It's different. It's like you said, I mean, the way that it sets up is different in terms of what they can be. It's not just going after the hot young thing over the established thing. It's more that they're going to push in a way that the Chiefs aren't going to. The Bills aren't going to. They're now cash strapped in a way that they had to sort of let some guys go, including Diggs, right? And they're going into the second phase of Josh Allen's career. Josh Allen's good enough that the Bills can still win, but I do think the Texans are able to add and build in a way, and they can get C.J. Stroud playing at a level that can contend with Josh Allen, and then you have more around him than Josh Allen's going to be able to have at this stage of his career around him in Buffalo. That doesn't mean – I mean, I think Buffalo did everything right in the 4 years they did. After the Diggs trade, I saw some opinions that were like, they shouldn't have acquired Diggs, which was like they didn't get enough out of it and they were a failure. And it's like, no, they very clearly, I mean, the year they lost to the Chiefs in the 13-second season or whatever it is, I can't remember the number ever, but they lost to the Chiefs in overtime, and it changed the overtime rules. We talked on the show, Sean, about they were the best team. That was their year. I think that's the year that the Rams ended up beating the Bengals. And you had a Super Bowl matchup of, a 4 seed and a 3 seed or whatever it was. The Bills were the team that year. If they could have won that game, and they were that close, and they very well easily could have. It was a 51-49 kind of game in terms of 51% to 49% win probability kind of game. Both teams played excellent, and it's not like the Bills played bad enough anyway. They gave themselves a window to win. Now they have to sort of reset a little bit. So I'm not trying to dog the Bills when I say the Texans are a bigger threat, but the Texans are at that point right now, and I don't think people realize it yet this offseason. I loved everything you said. After my first comment, and I was talking about the different receivers being so pricey, I sent it to you by saying you kind of looking at the other way, and I was sort of alluding to the note that you made about Stroud because you had mentioned that to me before, but that Stroud should go even higher. And when you said that, it really got me thinking about it differently as well. And the last note I just want to make on this is, as far as these 3 receivers are concerned, we've talked in past off seasons about identifying these types of situations and attacking them, because projections won't be able to get each of them to a high enough target volume and that type of thing. We did it the offseason that Tyler Boyd was still a thing, and young Jamar Chase and T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd were all going in the single digit rounds. and also young CeeDee Lamb, Michael Gallup, and Amari Cooper were all going in the same ranges in Dallas. And it was like, yeah, you just want to draft it. Somebody's going to win out. And not surprisingly, it was the young guys. When we look back at that, we're like, well, yeah, you should have been drafting CeeDee Lamb and Jamar Chase, obviously. But all of those, in those situations, those teams had a 3-man receiving core that probably were all being pushed down too much by the concern of there's too much target competition. And we know that things can consolidate, injuries can happen, etc. Part of the reason I think the Texans went out and got Diggs, or were going to add a receiver, is because Dell is small and did get hurt. And they didn't want to be down to just Nico Collins. They wanted to have 3 in case somebody gets injured again, right? Including potentially Dell again. And so the question is, like, why do I not like the ADPs at that point? And in talking with you, it's made me have to reconsider that, these are all very lofty prices. At the same time, I've argued when they're in a passing game that I love and feel really strongly about, when they're all in the 5th round, that they're all targets in the 5th round, right? And so, like, why can't they all be higher than that? It's a really interesting one. I love your note that this is one of the offenses that is going to define the 2024 season. I think we completely agree on that. And it is something where even at these steep prices, you want to be getting exposure somewhere. I find it also fascinating, obviously, that you're talking about getting the cheaper play in Tank Dell. I'm obviously going a little bit different there, and I like to get more Diggs and Collins, even at their pricier numbers. I do think those guys got to come into the 3rd, hopefully, over time.